The city exhaled a damp, weary breath, the kind that settled deep in the bones and made the morning feel older than it was. Leo traced the rim of his chipped coffee mug, the ceramic cool against his calloused fingertips. Outside, the rain fell in a steady, determined drizzle, blurring the edges of the world into a watercolor of muted grays and tired browns. The apartment was quiet, save for the rhythmic patter against the window pane and the faint scratching of a pencil on paper from the other room. It was the sound of his son Sam, lost in a world of dragons and starships, a world Leo fought every day to keep safe from the encroaching shadows of their own. He took a slow sip of the coffee, black and bitter, the last of the bag he'd been nursing for 2 weeks. The bill from the landlord sat on the counter, a stark white rectangle of judgment he'd folded and unfolded so many times the creases were soft as cloth. It lay next to a notice from the gas company, its red lettering a quiet, insistent alarm. He had $73 to his name, a half-tank of gas in his rusting van, and a mountain of scrap metal in his workshop that hummed with the ghosts of unpaid potential. Every piece of rebar, every discarded gear, every twisted sheet of copper was a promise he'd made to himself, a testament to the art he bled for. But promises didn't pay the rent. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture tired and automatic. It had been 3 years since Sarah passed, 3 years of holding everything together with welding sparks and stubborn hope. Some days, the hope felt strong, solid as the steel he shaped. Other days, like today, it felt like a flickering flame, one gust of wind away from being extinguished completely. A voice, bright and untroubled, cut through the quiet. "Dad, is the metal man sad today?" Sam stood in the doorway, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized hoodie he wore. In his hand, he held a drawing of a towering figure made of nuts and bolts, its head tilted in a way that was uncannily similar to the sculpture currently gathering dust in Leo's studio. Leo forced a smile, the muscles in his face protesting the effort. "Nobody, the metal man's just thinking." Sam patted over, his socks whispering against the worn linoleum, and held up the drawing. "He needs a heart. All the best ones have a heart." He'd drawn a small, glowing red circle in the center of the figure's chest. Leo's own chest tightened. He knelt, pulling his son into a hug, the scent of pencil shavings and childhood innocence, a sudden, sharp anchor in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. "You're right, kiddo." "He does." As they walked to the van an hour later, the rain had eased, but the air remained thick and heavy. Leo zipped Sam's jacket up to his chin, his fingers fumbling with the stubborn plastic. The city felt like a labyrinth of things he couldn't afford, of lives lived behind gleaming windows he could only look at from the outside. He was heading to a scrapyard on the other side of town, a long shot, a hope that the owner might have a piece of cobalt-infused steel he'd been dreaming of, a piece he had no real way to pay for. As he turned the corner onto a slick, leaf-strewn street, a flicker of black on the wet pavement caught his eye. He slowed the van, squinting through the rain-spattered windshield. It was a wallet. He pulled over, the van's engine rumbling a protest, and stepped out into the damp chill. The wallet was heavy, made of fine, unmarked leather that felt impossibly smooth in his rough hands. It was the kind of object that didn't belong on a forgotten side street, soaked in rainwater. He opened it, his heart giving a low, nervous thud. Inside, there was no driver's license, no photos, no personal effects, just a stack of crisp, new $100 bills, more money than he'd seen in one place in his entire life, and 3 sleek, black credit cards with no name, only a single stylized silver V embossed in the corner. His breath caught. There was an address, not on a license, but on a thick, cardstock business card tucked into a side pocket. It wasn't a home address. It was the address of the Vance Tower, a monolithic skyscraper of black glass and steel that pierced the city skyline like a shard of obsidian, a place as foreign and unreachable to him as the moon. He stood there in the rain, the weight of the wallet in his hand, feeling less like a discovery and more like a test. The drive to the scrapyard was a blur of unfocused thought, the wallet sitting on the passenger seat like a silent accusation. Leo's mind raced, a frantic slideshow of overdue bills, Sam's worn-out sneakers, the empty space in the refrigerator. The cash inside that leather rectangle could solve everything, at least for a month. It could be a breath of air when he was drowning, a pause button on the relentless forward march of debt. It would be so easy. No name, no face, just an anonymous tower of glass, and a person so wealthy they probably hadn't even noticed it was gone. He could just take it. Who would ever know? He glanced in the rearview mirror at Sam, who was humming softly in the back, tracing patterns on the foggy window with his fingertip. The innocence in that small, focused gesture was a punch to the gut. What kind of man would he be if he taught his son that the answer to their problems was to take something that wasn't theirs? The very thought soured in his mouth, leaving a taste more bitter than his morning coffee. The scrapyard was a bust. The owner, a grizzled man named Sal who smelled of rust and cheap cigars, just shook his head. Cobalt steel? In this economy? You're dreaming, Leo. He walked away, leaving Leo standing among mountains of decaying metal, the rain starting to fall again, colder this time. The weight of his failure pressed down, heavy and familiar. The wallet felt heavier now, its potential a mocking whisper. He got back in the van, the smell of damp metal clinging to his clothes, and drove not home, but downtown. The Vance Tower loomed larger as he approached, a monument to a world he didn't understand. It was sleek, impersonal, and radiated a kind of quiet power that made the street-level mortals scurry past without looking up. He parked the van 2 blocks away, its rusted side panels looking like a wound against the backdrop of polished sedans and black town cars. "We're just dropping something off, buddy," he said to Sam, his voice strained. He took his son's hand, the small fingers wrapping around his with absolute trust. The lobby was a cathedral of silence and marble. The air was cool and smelled of nothing, a sterile, manufactured emptiness. A woman with a severe haircut and a headset sat behind a desk that looked like a giant, polished slab of ice. Her eyes flickered over Leo's worn work boots and faded jacket, her expression a perfect mask of polite dismissal. "Can I help you?" Her voice was as sterile as the air. Leo held up the wallet. "I found this." The address on the card inside was for this building. The woman's composure cracked for a fraction of a second. She reached for the wallet, but Leo held it back. "I'd like to return it to the owner. In person." Her eyebrows rose, a silent question about his audacity. "I'm sorry, sir, that's not possible. If you leave it with me, I'll see that it gets to the proper channels." "I'm sure you will," Leo said, his grip tightening on the smooth leather. "But I'd still like to return it myself." He didn't know why he was pushing. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the need to prove to himself, more than anyone, that he was the kind of man who did the right thing, all the way through. The woman's lips thinned. "Who, may I ask, is the wallet for?" Leo paused. There was no name. He pulled out the business card with the silver V. "I'm not sure." This was the only identification. The woman's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as she saw the card. Her posture shifted. "One moment." She spoke softly into her headset, her gaze never leaving Leo. The silence stretched, amplified by the cavernous space. Sam fidgeted, his small hand still in Leo's. Finally, the woman looked up, her expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. "Miss Vance will see you, 40th floor." The elevator ascended with a silent, stomach-lurching speed. Sam pressed his face against the glass, watching the city shrink below, his breath fogging a small circle on the surface. "Are we going to space?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Leo managed a weak smile, his own stomach a knot of apprehension. "Feels like it, doesn't it?" The 40th floor was even quieter than the lobby. The air here was the same cool, scentless, still, but the silence felt different. It was the silence of absolute control. The walls were a pale, seamless gray, the floor, a polished concrete that reflected the muted light from floor-to-ceiling windows. There was no art, no plants, no clutter. It was less an office and more a minimalist fortress, A man in a suit so sharp it looked like it could cut glass met them at the elevator. His smile was thin and practiced. "Mr. Morgan? This way." He led them down a long hallway to a set of imposing double doors and opened one, gesturing them inside before retreating without a word. The office was vast, dominated by a single, massive desk made of what looked like a solid piece of dark wood. Behind it, a woman stood staring out at the rain-swept cityscape, her back to them. The entire wall was a window, and she seemed to be a part of the view, a silhouette against the gray sky. She turned slowly. Eleanor Vance was not what he had expected. He'd pictured someone older, harsher. But the woman before him was probably his age, with dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot, and a face that was strikingly beautiful but guarded, as if she'd long ago learned to shield her thoughts from the world. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored black dress, the only adornment a delicate silver watch on her wrist. Her eyes, a cool, intelligent gray, assessed him in a single, swift glance. "You're the one who found my wallet," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low and even, betraying no emotion. Leo nodded, stepping forward. "I am." He placed the wallet on the edge of her enormous desk. It looked small and insignificant in the vast expanse of polished wood. She didn't move to pick it up. Her gaze remained on him. "The security chief informed me it was found on a rather unremarkable street. He also informed me of its contents." Leo met her gaze, his own resolve hardening. He wasn't here to be interrogated or judged. "It was on the pavement. I just picked it up." "And you brought it back," she stated, her tone unreadable. "With everything still inside, my security chief finds that unusual." The implication hung in the air. That someone like him, someone who looked like he could use the money, should have taken it. Leo's jaw tightened. "I'm not looking for a reward, Miss Vance. I'm just returning what's yours." He started to turn, taking Sam's hand. "We'll be on our way." "Wait," she said. The word was sharp, commanding, but held a flicker of something else. Curiosity, maybe. She walked around the desk, her movements fluid and controlled. She stopped a few feet from them, her eyes drifting down to Sam, who was clutching his sketchbook to his chest. "What's that?" she asked, her voice a fraction softer. Sam, who was never shy, held it up. "It's my dad's art. I draw it." Eleanor took the sketchbook he offered. She flipped through the pages slowly. The drawings were childish, of course, but they captured the raw power of Leo's sculptures, the twisted metal, the fierce, beautiful agony in their forms. She paused on the drawing of the metal man with the glowing red heart. Her carefully constructed composure seemed to waver for a beat. She looked from the drawing to Leo, and for the first time, she truly saw him. Not as a problem to be managed or a curiosity to be dismissed, but as something else entirely, something real. She handed the sketchbook back to Sam. "Your father is very talented." She then looked directly at Leo, her gray eyes searching his. "Thank you for returning my property, Mr. Morgan. You're an honest man. That's a rarer commodity than you might think." The elevator ride down felt even longer than the ride up. Leo's hand was steady on Sam's shoulder, but inside, his adrenaline was a frantic hum. The encounter with Eleanor Vance had left him feeling exposed, as if she had peeled back a layer of him without even trying. She hadn't been unkind, not really, but her presence was a force of nature, a controlled storm that pulled all the air out of the room. He was relieved to be out of the tower, back on the rain-slicked streets where he belonged. Sam, however, was buzzing. "She liked my drawings, Dad. She said you were talented. Is she a queen?" Leo chuckled, the sound a little rough. "Something like that, buddy." He buckled his son into the van, the familiar creak of the seat, a comforting return to reality. He didn't want to think about Eleanor Vance, or her sterile, silent world, ever again. It was a world of power and wealth, so vast it was almost abstract, and he wanted no part of it. He was a man who built things with his hands, who found beauty in rust and decay. He and a woman who lived in a glass tower had nothing in common. Yet, As he drove away, the image of her cool gray eyes lingered. There had been a flicker of something behind the mask, a loneliness that felt strangely familiar. Back in her office, Eleonora stood at the window, the wallet now resting on her desk. She hadn't opened it. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what was inside, not just the cash and cards, but the unspoken message Leo Morgan had delivered. He had walked into the heart of her empire, looked her in the eye, and refused to be intimidated or bought. He had returned a small fortune without asking for a thing, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the grasping, transactional nature of her entire world. Most people who entered this office wanted something from her money, her influence, her time. They came with agendas and carefully prepared speeches. Leo Morgan had come with only his integrity and his son. She picked up the phone on her desk. "Marcus," she said, when her COO answered. "Find everything you can on a man named Leo Morgan. He's an artist, a sculptor. I want to know where he works, what he's sold, who he owes. Everything." There was a pause on the other end. "Is this a security concern, Eleonora?" "No," she said, her gaze drifting to the city below, where a beat-up van was likely disappearing into traffic. "It's a curiosity." She hung up and opened her laptop, the glow illuminating her face in the dimming afternoon light. A quick search brought up a simple, outdated website. Leo Morgan. Sculptures in steel. The gallery was sparse, the photos low quality, but the art itself was breathtaking. It was raw, emotional, full of a fierce, beautiful pain. One piece in particular held her attention. A towering figure made of gears and rebar, its head bowed, a hollow space carved out of its chest. The title was The Metal Man. It was the same one from her son's drawing. She stared at the image for a long time, the silence of her office pressing in. This man, this struggling artist with honest eyes and calloused hands, had created something that spoke a language she had long forgotten. He built things that felt, while she built things that calculated. And in that moment, a decision began to form, a quiet, reckless idea that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the hollow space in her own chest. 2 days later, a sleek black town car, the kind that was so clean it seemed to repel the city's grime, pulled up in front of Leo's studio. The building was an old converted warehouse in a forgotten industrial district, its brick facade streaked with grime and its windows coated in a permanent layer of dust. It was the last place one would expect to see a vehicle of that caliber. Leo was inside, a welding mask shielding his face, sparks flying as he worked on a new piece. The air smelled of hot metal and ozone. He didn't hear the car, but he heard the knock on the massive sliding door, a polite, hesitant sound that was utterly out of place. He shut off the torch, lifted the mask, and slid the heavy door open, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy glove. Eleonora Vance stood on his doorstep. She was dressed differently today, in dark jeans, a simple gray cashmere sweater, and flat leather boots. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she wore no makeup. Without the armor of her office and her power suit, she looked younger, more approachable, and yet her presence was just as potent. Leo stared, momentarily speechless. "Ms. Vance." She offered a small, tentative smile. "I was hoping you weren't busy." "I'm always busy," he said, his tone more defensive than he intended. He gestured to the chaotic interior of his studio. "As you can see." "I can," she said, her eyes sweeping over the space not with judgment but with an unnerving, focused curiosity. She took in the scattered tools, the piles of scrap metal, the half-finished sculptures that stood like metallic ghosts in the dusty shafts of light. "My company is looking to commission a piece for the new atrium in our research and development campus. Something significant. Your work came highly recommended." Leo crossed his arms, his posture a fortress of skepticism. "Your company. Right, and they sent you, the CEO, to a scrapyard artist in the worst part of town?" Her smile didn't falter. "I'm very hands-on with projects I care about." He didn't believe her, not for a second. This felt like something else, a debt she felt she needed to repay for the wallet, a form of charity dressed up in a corporate suit, and he wanted no part of it. "I'm not for sale, Ms. Vance. And my art isn't a decorative accessory for your corporate lobby." "I'm not looking for a decoration," she said, her voice steady. She stepped inside, her boots making soft sounds on the concrete floor. She walked toward the metal man, the sculpture that had captivated her on his website. She circled it slowly, her fingers tracing the air just inches from its rusted surface. "I'm looking for something that feels real, something that has a heart." The echo of his own son's words from her lips sent a jolt through him. He watched her, his defenses starting to feel thin and brittle. She wasn't looking at the piece as an investment or a status symbol. She was looking at it with a kind of quiet reverence, a deep, personal recognition that he hadn't seen in a client in years. Sam chose that moment to emerge from the small, partitioned-off area that served as his play space, a half-eaten apple in his hand. His eyes lit up when he saw Eleonora. "The Queen!" he exclaimed, running over to her without hesitation. Eleonora knelt, her expression softening completely as she looked at him. "Hello, Sam. I was hoping I'd see you." Sam pointed to the sculpture. "That's the sad man. Dad's gonna give him a heart soon." Leo watched them, a silent observer in his own life. The intimidating CEO was gone. In her place was a woman kneeling on a dirty floor, talking to a little boy about a sculpture's soul. And Leo, despite every instinct telling him to keep his guard up, felt it begin to crumble. Eleonora began visiting the studio regularly after that. She never called ahead. She would simply appear, always in the same understated, casual attire, often with 2 cups of coffee in her hands, one for him, one for her. At first, their conversations were stilted, focused entirely on the commission. She'd ask about his process, the materials he used, his inspiration. He'd answer in short, clipped sentences, his hands never stopping their work, as if staying in motion could keep him safe from whatever this was. He was still wary, still convinced this was an elaborate act of charity he was too proud to accept and too broke to refuse. But Eleonora was patient. She never pushed. She would sit for hours on an overturned crate, watching him work. The silence between them punctuated by the hiss of the welding torch and the clang of metal on metal. She seemed to find a strange peace in the chaos of his studio, a stark contrast to the sterile order of her own life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls between them began to thin. One afternoon she found him staring at a photograph tacked to the wall, a smiling woman with bright, laughing eyes, her arms slung around a younger, less weathered version of Leo. "Your wife?" Eleonora asked softly, coming to stand beside him. Leo nodded, his throat tight. "Sarah. She was the one with the real vision. She saw the art in all this junk before I did." Eleonora didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She just stood there, sharing the silence with him, her presence a quiet acknowledgement of his loss. Another day, he found her sketching in a small notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she noticed him watching, a faint blush rose on her cheeks. "Just ideas," she said, quickly closing the book. It was the first time he'd seen her look anything less than perfectly composed. Their conversations started to drift away from art. He found himself telling her about Sam's first day of school, about the time the van broke down in the middle of a rainstorm, about the small, everyday struggles and triumphs that made up his life. In return, she spoke of her own world, not in terms of stock prices or corporate takeovers, but in veiled allusions to its crushing pressure. "Sometimes the silence is the loudest thing in the room," she said once, staring into the middle distance. He knew exactly what she meant. Sam became the bridge between their two cautious worlds. He adored Eleonora, whom he still called the Queen. He would show her his latest drawings, tell her rambling stories about his day, and pull her into his imaginative games without a shred of self-consciousness. Eleonora, in turn, treated him not as a child to be placated, but as a person to be heard. She listened with genuine interest, her gray eyes full of a warmth Leo was beginning to realize wasn't an act. One rainy Tuesday, she arrived with a large, flat box. "For Sam," she said. It was a professional-grade art, set charcoals, pastels, fine-tipped pens, thick, creamy paper. It was an extravagant gift, the kind Leo could never afford. He started to protest, the word charity on the tip of his tongue, but Eleonora cut him off. "It's not a gift, Leo. It's an investment in a future artist." She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Let someone do something kind for you. It doesn't make you weak." Her words disarmed him. He watched as Sam's eyes went wide with wonder, his small hands tracing the smooth, new materials with reverence. In that moment, Leo felt a profound shift. The fortress he had built around his heart, stone by painful stone, was beginning to feel less like a defense and more like a prison. And Eleonora Vance, the woman from the glass tower, was quietly, patiently, showing him where to find the key. The sculpture for the Vance Tower atrium began to take shape. It was a massive, abstract piece, a swirling spiral of polished steel and rusted iron that seemed to reach for the sky, a fusion of their two worlds. Leo poured himself into it, the work a conduit for the complex, unnamed feelings that were growing between him and Eleonora. She was there most days, a quiet fixture in the corner of his studio, her presence a steady hum beneath the noise of his work. The commission was a lie. They both knew it now, though neither of them had said it aloud. It was an excuse, a fragile bridge they had built to span the chasm between their lives. One late afternoon, as the sun slanted through the dusty windows, casting long, golden shadows across the floor, Leo finally put down his tools. He was tired, his muscles aching, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from creation, not just survival. Eleonora sat on her usual crate, a book open in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in over an hour. "It's almost done," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, her eyes soft in the warm light. "It's beautiful, Leo." He walked over and sat on the floor near her, leaning his back against a stack of metal sheets. "You know," he began, staring at the sculpture, "I haven't felt this hopeful about the work in a long time. Not since Sarah." The admission hung in the air, vulnerable and real. Eleonora closed her book. "She would be proud of you. She'd probably be telling me not to trust the billionaire CEO who keeps showing up with coffee," he said, a half-smile touching his lips. Eleonora's own smile was faint, tinged with a sadness he was starting to recognize. "Is that what you think this is? Me, a billionaire CEO? And you, a project?" "I don't know what this is," he admitted, finally looking at her, "but it doesn't feel like a business transaction." "It isn't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She leaned forward slightly, her gray eyes searching his. "When I'm here, in this place, with you and Sam, I'm not a CEO. I'm not a Vance. I'm just Eleonora. And I haven't felt like just Eleonora in a very long time." The raw honesty in her voice was a current that pulled him under. The air between them crackled, the space shrinking until it was filled with only their shared breath and the silent, heavy weight of unspoken feelings. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to be seen and the fear of it. It was a fear he knew well. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the crate. The touch was tentative, electric. Her skin was soft, a stark contrast to his own rough, scarred hands. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly, a silent response. They sat like that for a long moment, the world outside fading away, leaving only the two of them in the dusty, golden light of the studio, on the precipice of something terrifying and beautiful. The sound of Sam's laughter from the other room broke the spell. Leo pulled his hand back, the loss of contact, a sudden, sharp ache. But when he met Eleonora's eyes again, the wall was gone. In its place was a shared understanding, a fragile, unspoken promise that this was something real, something worth protecting. The change in Leo was subtle at first, then undeniable. A lightness returned to his posture, The perpetual exhaustion in his eyes receded, replaced by a spark of something that looked a lot like joy. He started humming as he worked, old rock songs he hadn't thought of in years. He even bought a new coffee maker, a small, simple one, but it was a symbol of a future he was beginning to believe in again. Sam noticed it most of all. His dad laughed more, real deep belly laughs that made the whole studio feel warmer. They started taking weekends off, something they hadn't done since before Sarah got sick. They went to the park, the science museum, a local street fair, and more often than not, Eleonora was with them. She shed her corporate skin with an almost visible relief when she was with them. She wore old sneakers, let Sam put glitter in her hair, and learned to throw a frisbee with a surprising lack of grace that made them all laugh. She was awkward and unsure in this world of simple pleasures, but she was trying, and her effort was more endearing than any polished perfection could ever be. One Saturday, they went to the beach. It was a cool, overcast day. The sky, a blanket of soft gray, but the air was fresh with the scent of salt and sea. Leo and Sam built a lopsided sandcastle, while Eleonora walked along the water's edge, collecting shells. Leo watched her, a small smile playing on his lips. She looked so different from the woman in the glass tower, so much more alive. Later, as they sat on a blanket sharing sandwiches, Eleonora looked out at the waves. "I used to come to a beach like this with my grandfather," she said, her voice quiet. "He was the one who started the company. He built it from nothing, in a garage, not much bigger than your studio. He loved the smell of the ocean. He said it was the only thing big enough to make his problems feel small." Leo listened, sensing this was a rare glimpse into the fortress of her past. "What happened?" he asked gently. "He got successful," she said, a bitter edge to her tone. "The bigger the company got, the less he came to the beach. He started smelling like boardrooms and legal pads instead of salt. By the time he passed, he was a stranger in a suit who shared my last name. I promised myself I would never become him." She looked at Leo, her eyes full of a profound, aching sadness. "And then I did." He reached across the blanket and took her hand. "You're not him, Eleonora. You're here." Her fingers tightened around his. She looked from him to Sam, who was happily chasing a flock of seagulls down the shoreline, his laughter carried on the wind. A tear slipped down her cheek, the first one Leo had ever seen her shed. She didn't wipe it away. For the first time, she was letting someone see the cracks in her armor, and Leo wasn't afraid of them. He was starting to realize that the cracks were where the light got in. This fragile piece they had built, this bubble of authenticity in the middle of a loud, demanding world, was always destined to burst. The catalyst was a man named Marcus Thorne, Eleonora's second-in-command and the self-appointed guardian of the Vance corporate image. He was sharp, ambitious, and viewed the world as a series of assets and liabilities. And he had begun to view Leo Morgan as a significant liability. Marcus had been watching Eleonora's transformation with growing alarm. Her frequent absences from the office, her canceled meetings, her sudden interest in public art initiatives. It was all a deviation from the ruthlessly efficient CEO he knew. He'd had her followed, of course. The reports came back with grainy photos of her at a playground, in a dusty workshop, holding hands with a man who looked like he'd just stepped out of a labor union meeting. It was unacceptable. He chose to confront her not in the office, but at her sterile, high-rise apartment, a place as devoid of personal touches as her corporate persona. He found her on the balcony, staring out at the city lights, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside her. "This has gone on long enough, Eleonora," he said without preamble. She didn't turn. "This, Marcus, is none of your business. When the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation starts spending her afternoons in a glorified junkyard with a penniless sculptor, it becomes the board's business," he retorted, his voice clipped. "The stockholders are getting nervous. Your sabbatical is being interpreted as instability, and this man," he let the word hang in the air, thick with disdain. "He's a risk. A nobody with a sad story who could drag the Vance name through the mud." "His name is Leo," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. She finally turned to face him, her eyes as cold and hard as the glass surrounding them. "And he has more integrity in one of his calloused fingers than you have in your entire body," Marcus scoffed. "Integrity doesn't move markets. Perception does. And the perception is that you are being taken for a ride. Or worse, that you've lost your focus. What happens when the press gets a hold of this? Billionaire heiress finds love in the slums. It's a liability we can't afford." "Then sell your shares, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "Because I am not a liability. I am the CEO, and you are dismissed." His face paled, the smug confidence draining away to be replaced by disbelief, then fury. He left without another word, the sound of the door sliding shut echoing in the silent apartment. Eleonora stood alone on the balcony, the city lights blurring before her. She had won the battle, but she knew the war was just beginning. Marcus wouldn't go quietly. He would leak it. He would use the story to try and force her out, to paint her as unstable and her connection to Leo as a reckless, emotional folly. The world she had tried so hard to keep at bay was about to come crashing down on the one place she had finally found peace. The headline hit the internet like a flash flood. It was on a popular tech gossip blog first, then spread like wildfire. Vance Tech's reclusive CEO, Eleonora Vance, in secret romance with struggling artist. The article was accompanied by a long-lens photo of her and Leo leaving his studio, his arm casually resting on her back. It was a picture of simple, unguarded affection twisted into something salacious and transactional. By morning, it was everywhere. Leo found out when he went to the corner store for milk. His face, grainy and unfamiliar, stared back at him from the screen of the small TV mounted behind the counter. The cashier, a woman he'd known for years, suddenly couldn't meet his eye. His phone started buzzing in his pocket and didn't stop. Reporters began showing up outside the studio, a flock of vultures with cameras and microphones. They shouted questions at him, their voices a jarring intrusion into the quiet sanctuary he had built. "Mr. Morgan, how long have you known Miss Vance? Is it true she's funding your work? Are you in love with the billionaire?" He retreated inside, slamming the heavy door shut, his heart pounding a panicked rhythm against his ribs. This was it. The nightmare he had subconsciously been bracing for all along. He was no longer Leo, the artist, the father. He was a character in a story he didn't write, a supporting actor in the drama of a wealthy woman's life. The narrative was already set. He was the charity case, the gold digger, the blue-collar pet project. Sam came out of his corner, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Dad, who are all those people?" Leo knelt and pulled him close, his own fear a cold knot in his stomach. "They're just confused, buddy. It's okay. We're okay." But as he held his son, he knew it wasn't okay. The world had found them, and it was threatening to tear apart the fragile, beautiful thing he had just started to believe in. He had to protect Sam. That was his only job, his only purpose. And if that meant shutting the door on Eleonora, on the hope she represented, then that was what he had to do. The thought was a shard of ice in his heart. Eleonora tried to call, but he didn't answer. He watched her name flash on the screen, his thumb hovering over the green button, his heart aching with the desire to hear her voice. But he couldn't. The risk was too great. The reporters were still camped outside, a constant, menacing presence. Sam was scared to go outside. The studio, once a haven, now felt like a cage. She came to the studio that evening, after the sun had set and most of the press had dispersed. She knocked on the door, the sound soft and hesitant against the heavy silence. Leo stood on the other side, his hand on the bolt, his eyes closed. He could feel her presence, a warm, magnetic pull. "Leo, please." Her voice came through the thick wood, strained and full of pain. "Let me in. We can fix this." He leaned his forehead against the cold metal door. "There's nothing to fix, Eleonora. This is your world. It's not mine. I don't belong in it." "That's not true," she pleaded. "Our world is what we make it. Don't let them do this to us." "They're already doing it," he said, his own voice rough with unshed tears. They're outside my home. They're scaring my son. He's all I have. I won't let him be collateral damage in your corporate war." The silence on the other side of the door was heartbreaking. He could picture her standing there, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. He was hurting her, and it was tearing him apart. But the instinct to protect his child was a primal force, stronger than anything else. "I just wanted to be with you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know," he said, the words barely audible, "but I can't. I'm sorry." He heard her take a shaky breath, then the soft sound of her footsteps retreating. He didn't move. He just stood there, his hand on the bolt, as the sound of her car driving away faded into the night. The silence she left behind was a gaping wound. He had pushed away the only person who had made him feel whole in years, and he had done it to protect a life that suddenly felt empty without her. The studio was cold and quiet, the unfinished sculpture in the center of the room, a monument to a future that would now never be. He had made his choice. He had chosen safety over hope, and the weight of that choice was a crushing, unbearable thing. The days that followed were a study in gray. The media, having gotten their dramatic soundbite of a closed door and a heartbroken billionaire, eventually moved on to the next scandal, leaving a lingering chill in their wake. The quiet returned to Leo's street, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was hollow, empty, thick with unspoken grief. Leo threw himself into his work with a frantic, joyless energy. He finished the sculpture for the Vance Tower, pouring all of his pain and anger and loss into the metal until it was a twisted, beautiful scream. He called the corporate office, spoke to a low-level assistant, and arranged for it to be picked up. He didn't ask for Eleonora. He didn't want to know if she was even there. He just wanted it gone, a final, clean break. He tried to be the same father to Sam, but the laughter didn't come as easily. The light in his eyes had dimmed. Sam felt the shift. He stopped asking about the Queen. He stopped leaving his drawings on the workbench for her to find. The vibrant color of their small world had faded to monochrome. One afternoon, Sam sat beside him on the studio floor, quietly watching him weld. "Dad," he said, his voice small, "do you miss her?" Leo's hands stilled. He lifted his mask, his face a mask of weary sadness. "Yeah, buddy," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I do." "Me too," Sam whispered, leaning his head against his father's arm. "The metal man is sad again." Leo looked at his son, then at the empty space where the large sculpture had stood. He had built a fortress around them, but he hadn't kept the sadness out. He had locked it in with them. He had chosen to be safe, but he had forgotten that a life without risk, without the terrifying, beautiful possibility of love, wasn't really living at all. It was just surviving. And he was so tired of just surviving. Eleonora sat in the sterile, silent boardroom, the long table, a polished expanse of black that reflected the grim faces of the board members. At the head of the table, Marcus Thorne, who had been reinstated by a nervous board, presided with a smug, reptilian calm. They were here to discuss damage control, to strategize a path forward that would reassure the market and erase the stain of her emotional indiscretion. "We've prepared a statement for you, Eleonora," Marcus said, sliding a folder across the table. "It outlines a renewed focus on our Q4 projections and regretfully announces the end of your association with Mr. Morgan. It paints him as a brief, unfortunate lapse in judgment. It's clean. It will work." Eleonora looked at the folder, but didn't touch it. She thought of Leo, of his quiet strength, of the way he looked at his son, of the raw, honest beauty he created from discarded things. A lapse in judgment? He was the best judgment she had ever had. She looked around the table at the men in their identical dark suits, their faces impassive, their eyes calculating. They didn't see people, they saw profit margins. They didn't see art, they saw assets. They were the ghosts her grandfather had warned her about, the men who had traded their souls for stock options. In that moment, something inside her solidified. The fear, the doubt, the years of trying to live up to a name that felt more like a cage, it all fell away. She knew what she had to do. She stood up, her movement so sudden it made the board members flinch. "Thank you for the suggestion, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating in the quiet room. "But I will not be signing your statement. In fact, I have a statement of my own." She walked to the head of the table, took a remote from its cradle, and clicked it. The massive screen behind her, usually reserved for quarterly reports and market projections, flickered to life. It showed a high-resolution image of Leo's sculpture, the one he had made for her atrium, now installed and glowing under carefully placed lights. It was magnificent. "This," she said, her voice ringing with a power they hadn't heard in months, "is the new face of the Vance Corporation. Not quarterly reports, not stock prices. This. It's called Hope, and it was created by Leo Morgan, a man of more value and integrity than anyone in this room." She turned her gaze on Marcus, her eyes like chips of ice. "The Vance Foundation's new primary initiative will be dedicated to funding public art and supporting artists in underserved communities. Our first grant, a permanent, unconditional endowment, goes to Mr. Morgan's workshop, ensuring he can create without fear of financial ruin for the rest of his life. This is not charity. It is an investment in the things that truly matter: beauty, integrity, and heart." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "And one more thing. I am not stepping down. I am taking over. This is my company, my legacy. And from this day forward, we will be a company that builds things that feel, not just things that function. If any of you have a problem with that, the door is right there." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving a stunned, silent group of men in her wake. She had finally stopped running from her name and started defining it. And as she stepped into the elevator, she pulled out her phone and sent a single text to a number she had memorized. "Turn on the news. And please, don't shut the door." Leo was cleaning his workshop, a joyless, methodical task, when his phone buzzed with her text. His heart hammered against his ribs. He hesitated for a long moment, then walked over to the small, dusty television in the corner and turned it on. The business channel was in the middle of a breaking news report. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Eleonora Vance announces radical new direction for Vance Corp. Shocks Board." He saw her, standing at a podium, her face composed, but her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. He listened, his breath catching in his throat, as she spoke about art, about integrity, about him. She didn't mention their relationship, didn't try to explain or defend it. She simply stated his worth, his value, as an undeniable fact. She held up his art as a symbol of everything her company should aspire to be. He sank onto a nearby stool, the rag falling from his hand. The weight that had been crushing him for days, for years, began to lift. She wasn't ashamed of him. She wasn't hiding him. She was celebrating him, on the world's biggest stage, risking everything to do it. She hadn't just opened a door, she had kicked it off its hinges. Sam came over and stood beside him, watching the TV. "Is that the Queen?" he asked. Leo couldn't speak. He just nodded, pulling his son into a fierce hug. Tears streamed down his face, hot and cleansing. They weren't tears of sadness or loss. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had fallen in love with a woman he thought lived in a different universe, and she had just rearranged the stars to be closer to him. He didn't wait. He grabbed his keys, took Sam by the hand, and ran to the van. He drove downtown, his heart a frantic, hopeful drumbeat. He parked in front of the Vance Tower, the place that had once seemed so intimidating, and walked into the marble lobby, not with apprehension, but with purpose. He didn't have to say a word. The security guard just smiled and buzzed him up. The elevator ascended, and this time it felt like a journey home. He found her standing in her office, by the great glass wall, looking out at the city. She turned as he entered, her face pale, her eyes searching his, full of a million questions. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say he was sorry. He just cupped her face in his hands, his rough, calloused thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. and kissed her. It was a kiss full of all the words they hadn't said, a kiss that tasted of rain and rust and redemption. It was the closing of one story and the beginning of another. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "I was so scared you wouldn't come," she whispered. Leo smiled, a real, wide, brilliant smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. "You told me not to shut the door." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Behind them, Sam stood in the doorway, a wide grin on his face. He held up his sketchbook to a page he'd just finished. It was a drawing of the two of them, holding hands. And above their heads he had drawn a giant, glowing red heart. The metal man wasn't sad anymore. The unveiling was on a bright, crisp autumn day. The sculpture, Hope, stood in the center of a newly created public park, a green oasis carved out of the concrete heart of the city, funded entirely by the new Vance Foundation. The sun glinted off its polished steel surfaces, making it seem alive, breathing. A crowd had gathered: city officials, art critics, families with children, and the quiet, steady presence of Leo's friends from the old neighborhood. Eleonora stood beside him, not as a CEO, but as his partner, her hand resting comfortably in his. She wore a simple dress the color of the autumn leaves, and her face was relaxed and open, full of a light that had nothing to do with camera flashes. The media was there, of course, but their tone had changed. The narrative was no longer one of scandal, but one of inspiration. They spoke of Eleonora's bold vision, of Leo's powerful, transformative art, of a partnership that was redefining the relationship between commerce and creativity. When it was his turn to speak, Leo stepped up to the microphone, his nervousness eclipsed by a quiet, solid confidence. He didn't talk about the metal or his technique. He talked about what the sculpture meant. "Hope isn't about pretending the darkness doesn't exist," he said, his voice steady, his eyes finding Eleonora's in the crowd. "It's about finding the light within it. It's about knowing that even when things are broken, they can be remade into something even stronger, something more beautiful." He looked over at Sam, who was sitting on Eleonora's shoulders, his small hands tangled in her hair, a proud grin on his face. "It's about building things with heart." Later, after the speeches and the applause had faded, the three of them stood alone before the sculpture as the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and gold. The city buzzed around them, a distant, gentle hum. "So," Eleonora said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "what's next, Mr. Morgan?" Leo smiled, wrapping his arm around her, pulling her close. "I was thinking of starting a new piece." "Oh yeah?" she said, her eyes twinkling. "What's it called?" He looked down at her, then at their son, his heart full to bursting. "It's called Family." The sculpture was a silent testament behind them, a promise forged in fire and steel, a symbol of two disparate worlds melted down and reshaped into a single, unbreakable whole. The light was fading, but they were no longer afraid of the dark. They had each other. They had found their way home. The years that followed were not a fairy tale. They were something better. They were real. They were messy and complicated and beautiful. They were arguments over what to have for dinner and negotiations over Sam's bedtime. They were the quiet comfort of waking up next to the same person every morning, and the loud, chaotic joy of school projects spread across the expensive minimalist furniture in Eleonora's apartment, which slowly, piece by piece, started to look more like a home. It filled with Leo's smaller sculptures, with Sam's framed drawings, with muddy boots left by the door, and the lingering scent of coffee and turpentine. Leo's studio thrived. The Vance Foundation endowment gave him the freedom to create without the constant, gnawing pressure of survival. He built sculptures that were bold and challenging, pieces that spoke of struggle and resilience and the quiet, fierce beauty of the human spirit. He never became a part of Eleonora's corporate world, and he never wanted to. But he became her anchor, the one she came home to when the weight of that world became too much. He was the one who listened, who held her hand, who reminded her of the woman she was on the beach, the one who smelled of salt and not boardrooms. Eleonora, in turn, transformed the Vance Corporation. It became a leader not just in technology, but in corporate responsibility. The Vance Foundation for the Arts became a global force, funding public installations, providing grants for struggling artists, and building community art centers in forgotten neighborhoods. She was still a brilliant, ruthless businesswoman, but her ruthlessness was now aimed at injustice, not just at market competitors. She learned to delegate, to trust, to leave the office at 5 o'clock. She learned that success wasn't measured by stock prices, but by the number of lives she could touch, the amount of beauty she could help bring into the world. They married on a quiet Tuesday afternoon at the courthouse, with Sam as their only witness and best man. There were no cameras, no press releases. It was a simple, profound promise between two people who had found each other in the wreckage and built something extraordinary. Their life was a constant, beautiful juxtaposition. They attended glamorous charity galas, where Eleonora commanded the room in a designer gown, with Leo beside her in a simple, well-tailored suit, his calloused hands a stark, proud contrast to the polished world around them. And the next morning, they'd be in his studio, covered in dust, arguing over the placement of a piece of scrap metal, with Sam directing them both like a tiny, tyrannical foreman. They were two different worlds, two different languages, but they had learned to be fluent in each other. They had found their equilibrium not by erasing their differences, but by celebrating them. Their love story wasn't about a poor man being rescued by a rich woman. It was about two lonely, guarded souls who rescued each other, who showed each other what it meant to have a heart, and who proved that the most valuable things in life are the ones that can never be bought or sold. One crisp evening, years later, a teenage Sam sat with his parents on the balcony of their home, overlooking the glittering expanse of the city. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, velvet blue. Leo was sketching in a notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Eleonora read a book, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder. Sam had been quiet for a while, just watching the city lights. "You know," he said finally, "I was looking at some of the old articles about you guys online today, for a history project." Leo and Eleonora exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. "Yeah?" Leo said, his pencil stilling. "They got it so wrong," Sam said, shaking his head. "They made it sound like you were this project. And you," he looked at his mother, "were some kind of runaway princess." Eleonora smiled, a soft, genuine smile that had long ago replaced her guarded corporate mask. "That's what the world saw, I suppose. It's the easiest story to tell." "But it wasn't the story," Sam insisted. "The real story. It started with a wallet, and a drawing of a sad metal man who needed a heart." He looked at his father. "You gave him one, Dad. Not just in the sculpture." Leo's throat grew thick. He reached out and ruffled his son's hair. Eleonora took his other hand, her fingers lacing through his. The three of them sat in a comfortable silence, the city lights twinkling below them like a field of fallen stars. Their story hadn't been easy or simple. It had been forged in the fire of public scrutiny, tested by doubt and fear, and built on a foundation of quiet, stubborn love. They were a testament to the fact that true wealth isn't about what you own, but what you refuse to sell. And the most powerful legacy isn't a name on a building, but a heart you help to heal. The wind picked up, cool and clean, carrying the distant sound of city life. Leo looked at his wife, at his son, at the life they had built together, a life of art and industry, of love and integrity. The journey had been long and fraught with peril, but here, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The sad metal man was home. The gallery was silent, the kind of reverent hush that falls in a space filled with powerful art. The walls were white and impossibly high, and the light was soft, diffuse, falling on the sculptures that dotted the room like ancient metallic sentinels. This was Leo's first major retrospective, a lifetime of work gathered in one place. Critics and collectors moved through the space in quiet awe, speaking in hushed tones. At the center of the main room, bathed in a single warm spotlight, stood the Metal Man. It was the same sculpture that had once gathered dust in his studio, but now it was complete. In the hollow cavity of its chest rested a heart, not made of glowing red paint as Sam had once drawn, but of a single, perfect piece of cobalt-infused steel, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the faces of everyone who looked at it. Leo stood near the back of the room, uncomfortable in a suit, his hands tucked in his pockets to keep from fidgeting. He watched not the crowd, but his family. Eleonora was talking to a young, aspiring artist, her face animated and encouraging. She had long since passed the CEO title to a successor she'd mentored, choosing instead to run the Vance Foundation full-time. She was happier, lighter, more herself than he had ever seen her. Sam, now a young man with his father's eyes and his mother's quiet confidence, was a student at the country's most prestigious art school. He stood beside his girlfriend, explaining the nuances of his father's welding technique with a mixture of technical knowledge and fierce, filial pride. A reporter, a young woman with kind eyes, approached Leo. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "your story is incredible, a true rags to riches tale." Leo shook his head, a small, weary smile on his lips. "You've got it wrong. It was never about the riches." The reporter looked confused. "Then what was it about?" Leo's gaze drifted back to his wife and son, who were now walking toward him, their faces bright with love. He thought back to a rainy day, a lost wallet, and the terrifying, beautiful choice to do the right thing. He thought of a dusty studio, a shared cup of coffee, and the slow, patient crumbling of walls. He thought of a little boy's drawing and a love strong enough to rearrange the stars. "It was about value," Leo said, his voice quiet but sure as he took Eleonora's hand. "It was about learning the difference between the price of things and their worth." The reporter scribbled furiously in her notepad, but Leo knew she'd never truly understand. His story wasn't written in headlines. It was written in steel and rust, in courage and kindness, in the shared heart of the family that stood beside him, their reflections captured together in the center of his masterpiece. The workshop was quiet now, the tools hanging neatly on the walls, the floor swept clean. Leo didn't work here as much anymore. He had a larger, state-of-the-art studio downtown. But he kept this place, the old warehouse in the forgotten part of town. He kept it exactly as it was, a touchstone, a reminder of where it all began. He was teaching his grandson, a small, bright-eyed boy with a shock of dark hair, how to hold a wrench. The boy, whose name was Leo Jr., but whom everyone called Lucky, was diligently trying to tighten a bolt on a small metal bird his grandfather had welded for him. Eleonora sat on the familiar overturned crate, her hair now streaked with silver, a serene smile on her face as she watched them. She had a sketchbook in her lap, and she was drawing them, her lines now confident and full of love. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, the same golden light that had filled the room all those years ago. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into tiny, glittering stars. "Grandpa," Lucky said, his brow furrowed in concentration, "why do you like all this old, rusty stuff?" Leo smiled and knelt beside the boy, his hand covering his grandson's on the wrench. "Because, Lucky," he said, his voice soft, "this old, rusty stuff teaches you something important. It teaches you that nothing is ever truly lost. It can always be found. It can always be remade. You just need to have the right tools." "Like this wrench?" the boy asked. "Like the wrench," Leo confirmed. "And a little bit of patience, and a whole lot of heart." He glanced up and met Eleonora's eyes across the room. She smiled, a silent message of love and shared history passing between them. They had built a legacy, not of money or power, but of something far more enduring. They had built a life out of second chances. The sun dipped lower, and the studio filled with the warm, golden glow of memory and promise. The work was done, the story told. All that was left was the quiet, beautiful, ever-present hum of love.